In the wake of the disaster of Dragon Age The Veilguard and the extinction of that IP, many people have turned their last hope to the somewhat mythic beast conveniently being referred to as Mass Effect 5, a game whose very existence appears to be teetering on the edge of oblivion. But this hope also begs the question, why are so many people hopeful and wishful for a Mass Effect 5? You might have heard it before, but many people only had maintained a passing interest in the Dragon Age franchise, and were ultimately holding out their hopes for Mass Effect, desperate for a win in Dragon Age The Veilguard, in order that they might once again come to enjoy their beloved Mass Effect game. But why? Why indeed have people been so giddy and passionate about Mass Effect? To be sure, many such people feel this way simply because they want more space operatic drama. You know, the types whose sole interest is turning games into interactive romance novels. But there are still those who genuinely and sincerely appreciate Mass Effect for its contributions to the science fiction genre, its space opera status notwithstanding, which obviously is an important factor in the series' success. And these people are simply desperate for more science fiction, which forces us to ask the question, where has all the science fiction gone? If you think about it, even the most cursory glance cast at the gaming landscape will quickly reveal that there is a great deal of fantasy on offer when it comes to games, and specifically RPGs. In fact, when it comes to the RPG, fantasy is the default. And don't get me wrong here, fantasy is fantastic and I sincerely enjoy it. And I firmly count myself among those who ultimately prefer fantasy to science fiction. But that doesn't explain the relative dearth of science fiction RPGs compared to fantasy. To put it as simply as possible, science fiction is just harder to do and write than fantasy, and there are several reasons for this. But first, we need to understand what makes fantasy an easier genre to produce and write, as that explains its prevalence and will aid us in understanding the reasons why science fiction is notably more difficult to produce, and perhaps why, when science fiction is done well, it tends to have such a profound impact that even the best of fantasy struggles to replicate. The trick about fantasy is simple. It has a tried and true blueprint in a way that science fiction lacks. If we're honest, most if not all fantasy harkens back to J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, who himself was inspired by his many decades of learning as a philologist of ancient languages and his exposure to the rich history of European folk literature, such as the Old English Beowulf, the medieval Welsh's Mabinogion, or even Finland's Kalevala, among many others. Which means he had a lot to draw upon himself, and although fantasy these days is wide and varied, and sometimes starkly deviates from the Tolkien model, it almost always, whether consciously or not, takes inspiration from it. A great and rather obvious example of this is Dungeons & Dragons, until comparatively recently in its quest to appeal to the mythical, modern audience. You have humans, dwarves, elves, and orcs, which inarguably have taken their inspiration from Lord of the Rings, albeit very much so with their own twist, i.e., they have different founding myths and histories, and you also have halflings, who are basically hobbits. And beyond this, you also have gnomes and different variants of the aforementioned races. Hill dwarves versus mountain dwarves, high elves versus wood elves, and the fairly unique drow, who quite possibly at least took some inspiration from the dark elves of Norse mythology. And even orcs are significantly more fleshed out than they were in Lord of the Rings. You have various gods, and both celestial and demonic beings occupying different places in the cosmos, rulers and kings, wizards and warriors, and so on and so forth, and most fantasy relies heavily upon these tropes. And let me be the first to say that I don't think there's anything wrong with any of this. Quite the opposite, as having well-defined parameters allows you to more fully flesh out your world building and allows you to incorporate your own features and nuance, all the while being able to rely on a solid foundation for the basic building blocks of what you wish to create. And all this has the effect that A, there's much more fantasy fiction than that of science fiction, and B, it's easier to create, and the path of least resistance will forever be the one most chosen. And again, I say this as an aficionado primarily of fantasy, but it also illustrates the basic problem with crafting science fiction in my view, and that is the lack of a universal blueprint of the sort offered to fantasy via Lord of the Rings and early myths and legends from our own cultures and past. Science fiction simply has no counterpart, not least of which because, almost by definition, science fiction is forward-looking into our future, and often seeks to describe a potential as it relates to us humans in our current incarnation and temporal location. There is no real J.R.R. Tolkien when it comes to science fiction that serves as a reliable creative edifice, and while there has been successful science fiction in terms of books, tabletop games, films, and yes, of course, video games, the makers of such products invariably need to be more creative to produce them, which is to say there is no universal trope to draw upon that already does so much of the heavy lifting for you, which leads to yet another problem with creating science fiction: the question of which kind of science fiction it is you wish to create, which is not to say there's only one kind of fantasy, but rather it is necessarily more derivative as mentioned prior, and therefore easier. But sci-fi can take on much more radical forms, and yes, I am aware that the genres can sometimes blend into each other and cross-pollinate, and yes, I'm looking at you, Shadowrun. But that aside, the question of what kind of sci-fi you want to make is a very relevant one. Both the Deus Ex and Mass Effect series of games are classified as science fiction, but the themes and general message they seek to convey are highly distinct, i.e., dystopian dark future of humanity science fiction versus heroic humanity space hero on a galactic scale, and ultimately, they have very little in common with each other, save for the rubric of science fiction. Likewise, Frank Herbert's Dune, by now a certain cult classic, and much beloved, is also sci-fi, but would be relatively difficult to categorize as a specific subtype of science fiction, whereas looking again at fantasy, even looking at something such as D&D's Dark Sun campaign, or Obsidian's Tyranny, however unique they might appear to be, they still have recurrent themes you find everywhere in fantasy, such as magic, powerful potentates, and the struggle against evil, even going so far as to present to you the opportunity to pursue said evil yourself in the case of tyranny. And whilst these settings have many elements that are different from those of a Lord of the Rings, the basic skeleton of what we can recognize as fantasy is still there. And there is a last, and perhaps this is the most difficult differentiating factor between fantasy and science fiction, and that is believability and plausibility. Fantasy always has a unique get-out-of-jail card in that basically everything that might require a complex explanation can simply be explained away by magic, and in most fantasy, magic is a core component of the setting. Regardless of whether or not it is a high magic or medium magic or low magic setting, there will invariably be some sort of magical phenomena that do not require an explanation because of, well, magic. Magic just works because it is not of our world, and though there are many different types of magic, such as the distinction, say, between clerical or arcane in some settings, or memorized or innate a la wizards versus sorcerers, it just works because the setting would not function without the fantastical, hence the name fantasy, but not so with science fiction. Any science fiction setting that casually seeks to explain away complex, seemingly fantastical phenomena with some sort of parallel to that of fantasy forfeits its credibility to varying degrees, and the more often this happens in said setting, the more credibility is lost. This is because, as previously mentioned, in most cases, science fiction is a projection of our human existence into the future, and how things will look and work in said future, and thus it is usually bound by the same laws of the universe that we are bound by, and any limitation imposed upon us in our current day that is later shown to have been overcome necessitates an explanation that is both plausible to us and makes sense scientifically. In fact, the term space magic exists to describe a feature that has no real scientific basis and has simply been cooked up for reasons other than believability. Biotics in Mass Effect would be a good example of this. Despite having a decent explanation within the context of the Mass Effect universe, biotics are and remain what can only be called space magic at the end of the day. There is no real scientific explanation that displays continuity with our world to explain its plausibility, and thus, it just works, to borrow the infamous words of the legendary god Howard. Likewise in Mass Effect, the details of exactly how mass relays work with respect to FTL or faster-than-light speed travel are somewhat mysterious at best. The crew of a ship is just instantly teleported from A to B, seemingly with no temporal artifacts having occurred with respect to them or those who did not travel with them. And the magical element, Element Zero, is a fiction created within the universe to help facilitate this. Something happens, and it is sufficient, i.e., space magic. Now, I'm not saying this makes Mass Effect bad, as many people enjoy Mass Effect simply for the drama as a space opera, but space magic explanations are just less believable than, say, some wizard casting a mass teleportation spell, because yes, it's fantasy. Truly good science fiction tries to line up the state of knowledge in the sci-fi world with our own. A good example of this would be the character of Adam Jensen in Deus Ex: Human Revolution. Adam Jensen possesses unique genetic traits that allow him to effortlessly accept cybernetic augmentations that would otherwise be rejected by the vast majority of people due to genetic incompatibilities. Everyone else is forced to take something called neuropazine, a drug that allows people without Jensen's genetics to accept augmentations and prevents a process called neuroprothesis rejection syndrome, a buildup of scar tissue that blocks electrical signals between augmentation electrodes and human tissue, ultimately resulting in rejection and sickness. Adam Jensen's unique genome then stands at the center of this dystopian science fiction game, and a plausible explanation exists within the game that lines up, at least to some degree, with our understanding of the world, as there are many people who cannot take certain medications due to genetic reasons, or for whom medications do little or nothing based on their particular genome. Space opera, of course, is still more difficult because, unlike with fantasy, where you have a panoply of traditional fantasy races to draw upon, you have to typically create your aliens out of whole cloth, and they need to be at least somewhat convincing, and you really need creative solutions for this challenge. I think the up-and-coming game Exodus at least attempts to do this with the concept of the Celestials, having been genetically engineered humans who have evolved over millennia into something new and different. And Exodus furthermore attempts to work within the boundaries of our scientific understanding when it comes to travel at near light speed, with the effects of time dilation, and how they're integrated into the game. Now, I'm not making the claim that everything needs to line up one-to-one with our understanding of the world, but simply that scientific plausibility is an important element in most science fiction, and can serve as the glue to an otherwise difficult-to-believe setting, and frankly speaking, it's fairly hard to do, and much harder to do than a wizard waving a wand to turn someone into a mouse, or a cleric praying to gain power and strength from his deity. When you look at all the obstacles that stand in the way of creating good science fiction, the lack of canonical foundation as per fantasy, the lack of preset races or inhabitants in settings which require aliens, and the difficulty in writing credible and believable material with a scientific foundation, it becomes fairly clear why science fiction is just harder to manufacture than fantasy, especially when it comes to games. And this is likely why to date we have a glut of fantasy, not all of which is good, mind you, and comparatively speaking a paucity of science fiction, within which there are even fewer diamonds in the rough. Looking forward, the only two titles that may potentially hold up to scrutiny will be Exodus in the space opera subgenre, and perhaps the next cyberpunk game in terms of the futuristic dystopian subgenre. Either way, only time will tell. But if you like my content, you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated, as it really helps out my channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.